How do we avoid cancelling Christmas? I mean, it's hardly believe the words are leaving my lips, frankly. How much did we learn yesterday from Downing Street's press conference? Mr. Johnson set out the reasoning and reiterated the latest guidelines, very importantly, and he was insistent that this is not another lockdown.
I want to be absolutely clear. These measures are not another national lockdown. The whole point of them is to avoid a second national lockdown.
Are you convinced Britain faces a Christmas without large family gatherings after Boris Johnson announced tough new coronavirus measures to make it illegal to socialise in groups of more than 6? We went over that territory yesterday. I wonder if anyone will break the rule. By the way, at Christmas, are the police going to literally come knocking on doors on Christmas Day? Put the cracker down and approach the door, said the officer. Stay where you are or the turkey gets it. The list goes on. Normal life is unlikely to resume before the spring, the Prime Minister suggested as he pinned hopes for an end to restrictions on a moonshot mass testing programme. Can this really be achieved? Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, says we need to prepare for difficulties.
The period over autumn and winter, which is the period when all respiratory viruses have an advantage because people crowd together, more things are done indoors, amongst other reasons, is going to be difficult. So the period between now and spring is going to be difficult because this is a respiratory virus.
It's as simple as that. It's going to be difficult because it's a respiratory virus. Now, I'm putting all this together thinking, I'm sensing someone just hit the reverse gear here. Do we want to save lives? Of course we want to save lives. But it isn't life versus wealth. It's not getting back to work and the economy versus people contracting coronavirus and ending up on a ventilator. That's a false equivalence. There's much more to it than that. Mr. Johnson, of course, at that press conference yesterday, took loads of questions from the press, insisted that the latest advice is the right move. I want to know how you're feeling about this. 0344 499 1000. How do we avoid? Crazy question, yeah? How do we avoid cancelling Christmas? Johnson also focused on the fact that protecting schools and universities was paramount.
By bearing down on social contact and improving enforcement, we can keep schools and businesses open in the knowledge that they are COVID secure. I've always said schools and colleges should only ever be shut again as a very, very last resort.
Yeah, but tell us about Christmas. Can me Auntie Maureen come round on Boxing Day? Will I see my sister and her brood? I've got several nieces and nephews. Are they off the Christmas card list now? My own kids quite like seeing their cousins at Christmas. Is that now a no-no? 0344 499 1000. So schools and businesses protected, say the Prime Minister. I'm scratching my head on this. We are hearing rumblings about things like a curfew, a 10 o'clock curfew. That never happened before. Are you sensing we are going in the wrong direction, not the right direction? Of course, the big focus for the Prime Minister, if you didn't see that press conference yesterday, was setting out his 4 main rules.
The most important thing for all of us is to remember the basics. First, wash your hands. Second, wear a face covering over your mouth and nose if you're in an enclosed space. Third, make space. Always stay 2 meters away from people you don't live with, or 1 meter with extra precautions. Fourthly, if you have COVID symptoms, get a test and self-isolate. We're now processing 1.2 million tests per week.
You see, I get the theory behind all of this. I understand that. There's a common sense element about social distancing and washing your hands and just using your noggin when it comes to how we do this thing called life. But will any of those rules that he not unreasonably sets out make any kind of difference to the irredeemable reality that this virus hasn't gone away? And surely at some point, as we have seen just at the beginning part of this week, more people will get the virus. Is that not the reality? I think the journalist Dan Hodges wrote about this, and he put it rather well. He says the reality is we only have 2 choices. We return to some semblance of normal and accept infections and deaths will increase, or we lock down and accept the economy will collapse. What we don't want, it seems, to make that choice. And we posed that point back in March on this programme. That seems to be the reality, that nobody wants to make or take the big decision, one or the other. Anyway, back to the big question, though. Can we all have something, please, that resembles a normal Christmas?
Whether we're going to get things back to normal at all by Christmas, I'm still hopeful, as I've said before, that in many ways we could be able to get some aspects of our lives back to normal by Christmas.
I'm not sure. I think the family gathering thing at Christmas, I'd never even thought about this. I was just considering that if if a mate of mine comes around with his other half and their kids, we've exceeded the quota of 6. It's 2 adults, 2 children. The last time I looked, that's 8 people, right? How do we... I'm assuming it includes kids. Is that right, Con? It's got to include kids, isn't it? Does it include kids? Just adults. How is that going to work at Christmas time? I know some people say, look, we put together a panel of experts here. We've got a GP, a virologist, an economist, and a journalist. In a few moments, we're going to be asking each one of them to kind of set out their stall and their case and explain how we can avoid cancelling Christmas. Most importantly, of course, with this, as ever, are your thoughts, and think about where we're at. Think about the implications on that restriction. Think about what it means going forward. Think about what it means for normal family gatherings. Think about the importance of Christmas. By the way, I'm hearing people go, it's the first world problem. It's not just Christmas, it's any day. Of course it is. There is a sort of psychological line at the end of the year, isn't there? And it's sort of always the full stop is kind of Christmas. And for some people, it's just a festival. For other people, it's a religious time. Regardless, it's big, and I think it kind of amplifies in a very graphic way where we're at on this, that you couldn't have a normal family Christmas if that would normally include having some relatives over, sitting down and just enjoying what you normally would do with friends and family. That simply cannot happen unless it's 6 or below. 0344 499 1000. How do we avoid cancelling Christmas? Sounds crazy. That's the reality of where we're actually at. We've put together a panel of 4 here. We have a virologist, a GP, an economist, and a journalist. And let's find out from their perspectives how they think this could pan out. How can we avoid, if they think we can avoid it at all, of course, cancelling Christmas? We're going to give each of our guests 2 minutes to have a little bit of a rant and a talk and explain their position based on the latest developments. First up is Professor George Lomonossoff, virologist at the John Innes Centre. George, afternoon to you, sir. Good to have you with us.
Good afternoon.
Just before we kick off, I would get, when you were at university training for the big world of virology, thinking, wow, this is my calling, did you ever imagine you'd be making about 500 media appearances over the course of something like 3 months down to a pandemic?
No, I had no idea I'd be doing that at all. I always thought working in science would be almost on your own, late night, all alone with a test tube, as the Beatles song went. I certainly wouldn't be giving lots of interviews and
Indeed.
Talking to everyone.
It's just a kind of reflection of what extraordinary times we are. Ordinarily happy in a lab coat, a test tube and a microscope, and here we are live on national radio. So you're aware of the question here. We know the backdrop, George. We know what's been happening. So Professor George Lomonossoff, 2 minutes to tell us why we could avoid cancelling Christmas.
Well, I think the first thing to do is to try and avoid getting ill, which makes Christmas particularly miserable. And so I think distancing will be important. I also think it'll be important to actually work out in advance, assuming we're not going to be able to do things the way we have done, to think of other ways of doing it. I could be rather flippant and say make sure you've stocked up on enough booze and the other necessities, but also be prepared to have lots of conversations online with people and to enjoy that kind of way. It's not quite the same, but I suspect we will have to be in a more isolated way than, say, last year, which seems actually a completely different world. I think most people would agree. But I'm sure you can actually find ways of enjoying yourself without having to necessarily go out as you would like to in the old-fashioned way. of course, one can send presents to each other using delivery systems, which have really increased out of all proportion. So presents can certainly be exchanged in the kind of way they were in the past. And in fact, it makes it slightly easier to send things internationally. I imagine maybe Christmas cards will all be done by similar kind of ways. So, I mean, if you don't want to cook a meal, of course, plenty of ways of getting those delivered to you as well. So I think it's being prepared that things might have to be done differently, but you can still have fun in spite of that.
And you did it within 2 minutes. Fantastic. George, thank you. Professor George Lomonossoff, virologist at the John Innes Centre, with a sensible scientific approach to where we're at. Still to come, we'll talk to Dr Lawrence Buckman, also Rod Liddle, the columnist and journalist. First, though, let's go to Julian Jessop, independent economist. Julian, afternoon to you. And again, I mean, similar to as we were discussing there just with George, I mean, the amount of time that you'd ordinarily, he'd be there in a lab with a test tube, you'd be happy in a dark room with an abacus.
Yes, quite possibly. I think I would have spent a lot more time worrying about Brexit than I have been over the last few months. And I think that says something, that something's knocked Brexit off the headlines for a while.
Indeed it has. So, same question, of course. We're reflecting on the press conference, the latest announcements, the new laws, the regulations, what it means for the country, what it means for the economy, etc. So this is your perspective. Julian Jessop, independent economist. You have 2 minutes on the question, how do we avoid cancelling Christmas?
Okay, well, briefly, I think there are 3 key points. First of all, we need to avoid another national lockdown. If we did go back to where we were in April, we'd be back in a deep recession, and we'd all have a thoroughly miserable Christmas with or without COVID. So I think that has to be the priority. Secondly, the government needs to be very careful about the next steps that it takes. I think it needs to perhaps continue to intervene in some areas, but only in what I think we can now call a very specific and limited way. So maybe a few local restrictions, whether that's based on particular geographic areas or particular sectors of the economy or particular age groups. I think we need to avoid the sort of one-size-fits-all blanket restrictions that we had been relying on. And in particular, I think we need to be willing to give individual households and families more choice. I think it's absolutely right to ban huge gatherings, but when it comes to judging whether it's safe to meet 5 of your friends or 10 of your friends or 10 other family members, I think actually households themselves can often be left to make that decision because they're the best place to judge their individual risks. I certainly think the government was wrong to try and encourage people back into the office. If they're perfectly capable of doing their job safely from home, then I think that individual choice should be left to them. The final point is that I don't think the government should try and take all of the weight on its own shoulders. There was an interesting report this morning about how the University of Exeter is partnering with a private firm to do testing for COVID for staff and students coming back. I think in this country, we tend to assume the government has to do everything rather than adopting the more sort of decentralized and local approach that's been successful in other European countries, particularly Germany. So I think in short, the government, in a sense, needs to be bold by actually doing less rather than more and encouraging the private sector to step up to the plate as well.
And you did it right in time. Julian, thank you. Julian Jessop on 2 minutes there. Independent economist. There's a more economic perspective. Again, there's a lot of common sense coming out here. What are you chiming with at your end? 0344 499 1000. Chomping at the bit. Rod Liddle. We'll be with Rod in just a second. First, Dr Lawrence Buckman, former chair of the British Medical Association's GP Committee. Afternoon to you, Lawrence. And again, changing times. I mean, the world of medicine and the world of politics and economics, all kind of clashing in this curious Venn diagram of late. What a strange time we're in.
Yes, good afternoon. Much of my work involves dealing with patients who either have or could have COVID. I work part-time for the National COVID Assessment Service. So I'm speaking to people every day who are ill. And whether they have got COVID or not, I have to work out what to do with them. Now, in the event that flu turns up in the very near future, which it will, then we are going to have to separate this kind of illness from that kind of illness. And the only credible way to do that by remote assessment is to get people tested. There isn't any other way, really. There will be a vaccine probably next year, but that's not going to help us for Christmas this year. Christmas, of course, is not cancelled. It'll just be different. And other speakers have already commented on how different it will be. You won't be able to gather in groups of more than 6, probably. So you're going to have to do things online. Gift giving, the same. Turkey tastes just the same, whether there's 6 of you or 26 of you. But you won't be doing quite the same things at the same volume. And it's inevitable because it's in the winter. Now, if you want to move Christmas to the summer, you might have a different conversation, but that's not going to happen. So I think we're going to see, we are seeing in the COVID service, a rapid rise in inquiries, many of whom, of course, have got COVID in certain parts of the country. And I think we are going to need to be much more careful about who we associate with and how many. I like the idea of personal discretion, but actually 6 and no more does have a sort of simplicity about it. And the government were criticised for not being simple. And I suppose if you want to be simple, this is the way to do it.
And within 2 minutes as well. Thank you, Lawrence. Always good to talk, sir. Thank you for your time. Dr Lawrence Buckman, former chairman of the British Medical Association's GP Committee. Let's speak with Rod Liddle, Sun columnist. And I guess the chaos, Rod, over the last 6 months, I mean, it kind of feeds into, you're a fairly morose character most of the time, and frankly, a better human being for it, Rod. And I've always thought, when I read your fine words and your missives and the like on a weekly basis, wherever that happens to be, you know, this has probably given you more material than you could ever have imagined in your career as a journalist.
Yes, so it is getting a bit tedious.
Yeah.
Stories are good when they last for a certain length of time. This one's been going on rather too long.
Indeed, it needs to reach some kind of conclusion. Well, let's see what we do here. Let's get 2 minutes on this if we can, Rod. Your fine words, sir, based on events of the last sort of 24, 36 hours or thereabouts. But the prime question we are running here: how do we avoid cancelling Christmas, Rod?
Very simple, and it's something which we haven't done so far, which is to take responsibility for our own lives and the lives of others, instead of putting it all onto the government. I don't think that the government has done a very good job with COVID. I think it was slow in the beginning to recognise the danger posed by the virus, desperately slow to lock down, desperately slow to close the borders. I think it's made many, many mistakes. It's flip-flopped. It's done 12 U-turns in the space of 3 months, which I think is a British record and may indeed be an international record. So I don't think it's done terribly well. But I think, in a sense, the time to blame the government isn't now. The thing to do now, if we want to have a decent Christmas, is to take responsibility for ourselves, and that means obeying the suggestions and indeed the regulations as to how many people should gather together, to go out less often, to do your shopping once a fortnight or once a week at the very most, to shop locally, to keep washing your hands, to do all the stuff which we were kind of doing in lockdown, and to keep doing it to make sure that we can have a better Christmas. Because at the moment, what I see happening is a perpetual growl and moan of fury from people who have been told that they can't do this and they can't do that. Well, the reason the government is imposing these restrictions is because we're not doing it for ourselves, and we should be doing it for ourselves. We should take responsibility for what we do, and we should limit the amount of contact we have with other people. We should try not to go to the pub. How about that for a suggestion? Try not to go to the pub. And you never know. By the time Christmas comes along, you may have saved enough money to have a real bumper Christmas, rather than a Christmas full of illness and, of course, poverty.
And on that point, you got there, Rod. Great stuff, as ever. Thank you, Rod Liddle, the journalist, associate editor at The Spectator, writer for The Sun of the Times. Great to have him as the final voice. Well, you heard 4 perspectives there. Professor George Lomonossoff, the virologist. You heard Julian Jessop, the economist. Dr Lawrence Buckman, former head of the British Medical Association's GP Committee, a GP himself, of course, and the last voice there, Rod Liddle. There was a breadth of opinion. It's interesting. Rod always goes against type, because you think Rod would be that voice of, no, let's get to the pub, open the pubs up, get the flagons of ale in, and let's just ignore this nonsense and get on with it. He's actually far more measured. We've spoken to him a couple of times on this. But where do you sit on the question? How do we avoid cancelling Christmas?